In the silence after loss, Clara's hands remembered what her heart tried to forget. 5 winters of solitude, with only the whisper of snow against windows for company. Her eyes, once bright with love, now reflected only empty rooms where Thomas's laughter used to echo. Then came the blizzard that changed everything. A child's desperate knock, a wounded stranger, small fingers reaching through the fortress of her grief, rain-damp hair and trusting eyes asking for shelter she wasn't sure she could give. Sometimes healing arrives disguised as an interruption. Sometimes empty hands find purpose when they learn to hold something new. If this moment touches the quiet places in your heart where memories live, let your like be a gentle acknowledgement, a way of saying, I too have known both winter and spring. And please comment how you think Clara's story ends. Does the heart that's been broken ever truly learn to trust the promise of tomorrow again? The wind whispered ancient secrets through the cracks of the weathered farmhouse, its cold fingers, reaching into corners Clara Beaumont had long forgotten existed. Outside, the blizzard painted the world in shades of white, so pure they hurt the eyes, erasing boundaries, softening edges. 3 days now, this crystalline imprisonment. 3 days of nothing but the creaking of the old wooden beams above her head and the occasional whinny from the horses in the barn. Clara sat by the window, her reflection ghostly against the frosted glass, her hands cradling a mug of tea gone, cold. Time moved differently here in Ironwood during winter, slower, heavier, like honey crystallized at the bottom of a forgotten jar. The isolation didn't bother her anymore. After 5 years, solitude had become a familiar companion, more reliable than most people had ever been. She traced the rim of her wedding band, still encircling her finger like a promise that outlived its speaker. Thomas had loved this land with a fierceness that sometimes scared her. This soil knows our heartbeats, he'd say, pressing her palm against the earth. Now only her heartbeat remained, a solitary rhythm beneath the howling wind, the Fae. Grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 7 times, each told a ripple in the ocean of silence. Clara's eyes drifted to the photograph on the mantelpiece, she and Thomas on their wedding day, his eyes crinkling at the corners, her face turned toward him like a flower seeking sunlight. Before Benjamin Crowley had set his sights on their land, before men with cold eyes and colder hearts had come with papers and threats, and finally, Clara closed her eyes. The memory of gunshots always came with the snow. She rose from her chair, bones creaking in protest, and moved to stoke the dying embers in the fireplace. The logs hissed and sputtered, tiny rebellions against the encroaching dark. Clara watched the flames dance, seeing in their movements the story of her life, once wild and bright, now carefully contained, sustaining only what was necessary. Sudden noise from the direction of the barn cut through the wind's mournful song. Sharp, distinct, human. Clara froze, her heart a startled bird against her ribs. No one came to Harper's Hollow during a blizzard. No one came to Harper's Hollow at all. The old shotgun felt foreign in Clara's hands as she made her way through knee-deep snow, each step a labored negotiation with the earth. The lantern she carried cast distorted shadows across the white expanse, transforming familiar shapes into monstrous silhouettes. Her breath formed clouds that dissolved into the night, ephemeral ghosts accompanying her journey to the barn. The 20 yards between, house and barn stretched like miles. Wind clawed at her coat, found the vulnerable spaces between buttons beneath her collar. Cold seeped into her bones, a familiar ache that mirrored the one in her chest. Another sound, a thud, followed by a whispered hush. Clara tightened her grip on the shotgun, feeling the rust beneath her fingertips. It hadn't been fired since Thomas. The barn door protested as she pushed it open, its hinges screaming betrayal into the night. The lantern light spilled across the straw-covered floor, illuminating 2 figures huddled in the corner. A man, sprawled unconscious, blood darkening his pant leg. And beside him, a small figure, a child with wide eyes and hair the color of wheat, trembling but defiant. "Don't hurt him," the girl whispered, her voice thin but steady. "Please, he's all I got." Clara lowered the shotgun slightly, studying the scene. The man's face was pale beneath a week's growth of beard, his breathing shallow. The girl, she couldn't be more than 8, had wrapped him in a threadbare blanket, his head cradled in her small lap. "My name is Nina," the girl said, lifting her chin. "And that's my father. He's hurt real bad. Please. He's bleeding." Clara stood frozen. In the doorway, the past and present colliding in a moment of impossible decision. The wind howled outside, rattling the barn walls like it was trying to remind her of something important. "What happened to him?" Clara finally asked, her voice rough from disuse. "Men stopped us on the road," Nina replied, eyes darting to the barn door as if expecting those men to materialize. They knew his name. Clara knew she should send them away. Strangers meant danger. Strangers meant change. But the snow was relentless, and the child's eyes held a familiar desperation that tugged at something long dormant within her. "Can you help him stand?" Clara asked, setting down the lantern. "The house is warmer." The kitchen filled with the scent of boiling herbs, comfrey and yarrow harvested months ago, dried and bundled, hanging from the rafters like forgotten prayers. Clara worked methodically, her movements precise and distant as she cleaned the wound on the stranger's leg. The bullet had only grazed him, but the cold had worsened what might have been a minor injury. Jonas Whitmore, he'd managed to tell her, before pain pulled him back under. A name that meant nothing to her. Just another traveler passing through her life, leaving footprints that would soon be covered by new snow. The girl, Nina, sat at the kitchen table, her small hands wrapped around a mug of hot milk sweetened with the last of Clara's honey. Her eyes followed Clara's every movement, wary yet hopeful, a combination that made Clara's chest tighten uncomfortably. "You're good at that," Nina observed quietly, as Clara applied a poultice to Jonas's wound. "Had practice," Clara replied, not looking up. The less said, the better. Words had a way of creating connections, and connections meant pain when they inevitably broke. "Is this your farm?" Nina asked, undeterred by Clara's brevity. Clara nodded, tying off the bandage with fingers that remembered this dance too well. How many times had she patched up Thomas after long days working the difficult northern soil? The memory rose unbidden, Thomas laughing as she fussed over a cut on his hand, pulling her down onto his lap, whispering that her touch was better medicine than any poultice. "It's a nice place," Nina said, her voice small but sincere. "Got horses and everything." Clara glanced at her, really seeing the child for the first time, thin shoulders beneath a coat too large for her frame, eyes older than they should be. A single braid coming undone, revealing the care someone had once taken to weave it. "There's a room upstairs," Clara said abruptly, standing. "Small, but it's got a bed. Your father can take the sofa here by the fire." Nina slid from her chair, approaching her father with practiced care. She touched his forehead, a gesture so tender it made Clara look away. "He's cooler now," the child observed. "That's good, right?" Clara nodded, busying herself with cleaning up the medical supplies. "He needs rest, and to stay warm." "Thank you," Nina whispered, the words hanging in the space between them like delicate crystals. "For not sending us back out there." Clara didn't respond. Kindness wasn't what this was. Practical decisions in impractical weather, nothing more. She wouldn't name the feeling that had stirred when she'd seen the girl cradling her father's head. Wouldn't acknowledge the echo of a dream long abandoned, the child she and Thomas had planned for, before Crowley, before the gunshots, before the silence. "The room's this way," she said instead, picking up the lantern. "Mind the third step, it creaks." Morning arrived with tentative light, filtering through clouds still heavy with snow. Clara rose with the dawn, a habit unchanged by seasons or circumstances. The house felt different, the silence disrupted by the presence of strangers breathing within her walls. She moved quietly through her routine, building the fire, setting water to boil, listening for sounds from the sofa where Jonas Whitmore slept. When she entered the kitchen, she found him awake, attempting to sit up, his face drawn with pain but determined. "You'll tear the stitches," she said by way of greeting. He stilled, eyes finding hers, blue like the forgotten summer sky, startling against his weather-worn face. "Good morning to you too, ma'am." Clara ignored the gentle reproach in his tone, setting down a kettle with more force than necessary. "How's the leg?" "Better than it should be, thanks to you." His voice was deep, with an accent she couldn't place. Not quite southern, not eastern either. I owe you a debt. You owe me nothing, Clara replied, measuring coffee grounds with careful precision. The storm would have killed you both. I'm not in the business of finding frozen bodies on my property. Ghost of a smile touched his lips. Still, thank you for taking us in. Nina, she's been through enough. Clara nodded once, acknowledging his words without inviting further conversation. The coffee began to percolate, filling the kitchen with its rich aroma. Outside, the storm had gentled to steady snowfall, flakes drifting. Jai passed the window like lost thoughts. I noticed your chicken coop lock is broken, Jonas said after a moment of silence. And that back fence, the one leading to the north pasture. It won't hold if the snow gets any deeper. Clara turned, eyebrow raised. You noticed all that while bleeding in my barn? His smile widened slightly. I notice broken things, old habit. He shifted, wincing. I could fix them for you, once I can stand properly. Why would you do that? The question emerged sharper than she'd intended. Jonas met her gaze steadily. Because things that are broken deserve to be fixed. Something in his words caused a hairline crack in the wall Clara had built around herself. Before she could respond, small footsteps sounded on the stairs, and Nina appeared in the doorway, hair mussed from sleep, eyes brightening at the sight of her father awake. Papa! She rushed to him, careful of his injured leg. You're better! He pulled her close with one arm. Tougher than I look, Songbird. Clara turned away from the intimacy of their embrace, focusing on pouring coffee, on the steam rising from the mug, on anything but the ache that witnessing their closeness awakened in her. Miss Clara has horses, Nina said, her voice animated. For the first time. I saw them yesterday, big ones with spots. Appaloosas, Clara supplied, surprising herself. 4 of them. Could I see them again? Nina asked hesitantly. I'll be careful, I promise. Clara looked at the child, her eager eyes the hope they're so naked and vulnerable. She remembered herself at that age, following her father around the very same farm, learning the language of animals and earth. They need feeding, Clara said finally. Come on, then. As she led Nina outside, she felt Jonas Whitmore's gaze following them, warm and curious, like the first tentative sunbeam after endless cloudy days. The days stretched into a week, then 2. The snowfall ebbed, revealing a landscape transformed. White. Plains where fields should be. Gentle mounds marking fences and stone walls. Everything simplified, purified by winter's touch. Clara's routine expanded, almost imperceptibly at first, to include her unexpected guests. Jonas, true to his word, began to repair things around the farm as soon as he could walk without wincing. Clara would find him in the chicken coop, reinforcing the door, by the back fence driving new posts into the partially frozen ground, in the kitchen, fixing the drawer that had stuck since before Thomas died. His hands were deft and patient, finding solutions where Clara had seen only problems too insignificant to address. Nina shadowed Clara through morning chores, her questions constant but thoughtful. Why do you talk to the horses like that? How? Do you know which plants to keep in the greenhouse? Did you build this farm yourself? Each question like a small stone dropped into still water, creating ripples Clara couldn't control. Clara found herself watching them when they didn't notice. Jonas, teaching Nina to whittle by the fireplace, wood shavings curling at their feet. Nina reading aloud from one of Clara's old books, her father listening with undisguised pride. These quiet moments stirred something buried deep beneath years of practiced solitude. One afternoon, Clara returned from checking the property boundaries to find Jonas in the small greenhouse attached to the kitchen, carefully tending to her winter herbs. Sunlight filtered through the glass, catching in his dark hair, illuminating threads of silver at his temples. He looked up as she entered, offering that now familiar half-smile. "Hope you don't mind," he said, gesturing to the freshly turned soil around the rosemary plants. They needed room to breathe. Clara moved closer, inspecting his work. "You know about herbs?" He nodded, brushing soil from his fingers. "My grandmother was a healer back in Kentucky, taught me which plants heal and which harm." He paused, looking at her directly. said knowing the difference was the most important lesson in life. Clara felt the weight of his gaze, the implication in his words. She busied herself arranging pots on the shelf. "Smart woman. She would have liked you," Jonas said softly. "Said the strongest people are those who keep growing even in the harshest conditions." He touched a sage plant, its silver-green leaves reaching toward the weak winter light. Like these, surviving despite everything. Clara's hands stilled on the clay pots. No one had spoken to her like this in years, looking beneath her surface, seeing something more than a widow guarding an isolated farm. It was unsettling, intrusive. "Necessary," whispered a voice she'd long silenced. "Nina's waiting for you," she said abruptly. "She's named all the chickens, thinks you should meet them properly." Jonas chuckled, the sound warming the small space between them. "Can't disappoint the ladies, then." He moved past her toward the door, his shoulder briefly brushing hers. Even through layers of clothing, the contact sent a jolt through Clara's body. A reminder that she was still flesh and blood and nerve endings, still capable of response. Later, watching from the kitchen window as Jonas and Nina fed the chickens, their laughter visible in puffs of condensation in the cold air, Clara pressed her palm against the glass. The chill against her skin anchored her to reality, to the truth she couldn't escape. These people would leave when the roads cleared. This temporary thaw in the weather, in her heart, was just that. Temporary. She turned away from the window, from the sight of Nina throwing her head back in delight as a chicken pecked grain from her small palm. But the image stayed with her, like a photograph developing slowly in her mind, impossible to unsee. Evenings developed a rhythm of their own. After supper, meals that had gradually evolved from Clara's silent, efficient sustenance to something approaching communion. Jonas would build up the fire while Nina helped Clara with the dishes. Then the child would settle on the rug with paper and the colored pencils Clara had unearthed from a forgotten drawer, drawing horses and chickens and impossibly blue skies. Tonight, Nina had fallen asleep earlier than usual, curled on the sofa, beneath a quilt Clara's mother had made decades ago. Jonas carried her upstairs with tender care, his limp barely noticeable now. When he returned, he found Clara on the porch, wrapped in her heavy coat, watching stars appear in the clearing sky. He joined her without speaking, respecting the delicate silence. The cold was sharp, but clean, purifying. Their breath mingled, in the air between them. "Storm's finally breaking," Clara said, nodding toward the horizon where the clouds had parted to reveal a silver moon. "Yes," Jonas agreed. "Roads should be passable soon." The unspoken hung between them. What would happen when leaving became possible again? Clara gripped the porch railing, the rough wood grounding her against unexpected emotions. "Nina loves." "Side here," Jonas said quietly. "She hasn't been this happy since—" He trailed off, and Clara found herself turning to look at him. His profile was sharp against the night sky, jaw clenched against memories. "Since her mother died," Clara supplied, surprising herself with the directness of the question. Jonas nodded, a barely perceptible movement. "Margot, she died giving birth to Nina. I was away, government assignment across state lines. Didn't even know she'd gone into labor early until it was too late." His voice held no self-pity, only a bone-deep weariness Clara recognized. "Spent years after that fixing broken towns, broken systems. Thought if I repaired enough things outside, the inside might follow." Clara absorbed his words, the weight of them, the way he spoke Margot's name, with reverence, but without the desperate clutching she still felt when thinking of Thomas. "Thomas died with his hands in the dirt," she found herself saying, the words emerging from some long-sealed chamber of her heart. "Refused to sell this land to Crowley and his developers. Said a man who surrenders his home surrenders his soul." Her fingers twisted her wedding band unconsciously. "They shot him by the North Oak. I found him there, still holding onto a fistful of earth." She hadn't spoken of that day to anyone. The words felt strange in her mouth, both bitter and liberating. "So, you stayed," Jonas said, "not a question. For him, for this place. They're the same thing in my mind." Clara looked out at the moonlit expanse of her farm. "Everyone said I should sell after that, move somewhere civilized. as if civilization had anything to do with goodness. Jonas's hand came to rest beside hers on the railing, not touching but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. "Some things are worth protecting," he said softly. "Worth fighting for." Clara turned to look at him fully, finding his eyes already on her. Something passed between them. Recognition, understanding, the silent acknowledgement of shared wounds. Not the electric attraction of new love, but something more profound. The quiet revelation that broken pieces could still fit together to create something whole. They stood there in companionable silence until the cold drove them inside. Neither, acknowledging what had shifted, what boundaries had dissolved in the telling of their stories. Clara found it at dawn, the severed bull's head placed precisely at her front gate, its vacant eyes staring accusingly, blood frozen in dark rivulets on the snow. A message as clear as if Crowley himself had stood before her and issued the threat. She didn't allow herself to tremble. Instead, she fetched a shovel from the barn, dragged the grisly warning to the far edge of the property, and buried it beneath salt and snow. Only when the task was complete did she permit herself to lean against a fence post, breathing deeply of the cold morning air, willing her heart to steady its frantic rhythm. They knew. Somehow they knew about Jonas and Nina. When she returned to the house, Jonas was at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he'd prepared himself. One look at her face, and he was on his feet. Clara brushed past him, removing her gloves with methodical precision. "Nothing that concerns you, Clara." The way he said her name, soft but insistent, made her pause. What did they do? She turned to face him, suddenly weary of carrying burdens alone. Bull's head at the gate. Crowley's men left it during the night. Jonas's expression darkened. "Because of us." "Because Crowley has wanted this land for years," Clara corrected him. "You're just a convenient excuse." She filled a kettle, movements sharp with suppressed anxiety. The relative peace of the past week seemed suddenly fragile, a dream from which she'd been rudely awakened. "We should leave," Jonas said quietly. "Nina and I, as soon as the road's clear." Clara kept her back to him, focusing on the blue flames of the stove. "Yes, you should." The words tasted like ash in her mouth. Footsteps on the stairs announced Nina's arrival. She bounded into the kitchen, hair wild from sleep, eyes bright with plans for the day. "Can we check if the pond's frozen enough to slide on?" she asked, oblivious to the tension between the adults. Clara and Jonas exchanged a glance over the child's head, a silent agreement to shield her from their concerns. "After breakfast," Clara said, forcing lightness into her voice, "and only if you wear 2 pairs of socks," as she helped Nina butter. "Toast?" Clara felt Jonas watching her, his gaze a tangible weight. She knew what he was thinking, that their presence endangered her, that the safest choice would be for them to go. What he couldn't know was how the thought of returning to silence terrified her more than any threat Crowley could deliver. Later, at the pond's edge, Clara watched Nina slide across the ice, her laughter echoing against the surrounding trees. Jonas stood beside Clara, close enough that their shoulders occasionally brushed, each point of contact sending warmth through her despite the bitter cold. "You've made a home here," he observed, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Despite everything?" Clara nodded, watching as Nina carefully arranged pine cones in a pattern on the ice. "Not much choice. Nowhere else to go." "There are always choices," Jonas said. "Even when they all seem impossible." She turned to look at him, really look at him, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the scar above his right eyebrow, the way the winter light revealed flecks of grey in his beard. In 3 weeks he'd transitioned from stranger to, what? Not quite friend. Something undefined, unmarked on any map she recognized. "Why were you really on that road during a blizzard?" she asked suddenly. "What brings a man and his daughter out to Ironwood in the dead of winter?" Jonas held her gaze, a decision visibly forming behind his eyes. "Truth?" Nothing less would be worth hearing. He nodded, turning to watch Nina as he spoke. "I've been appointed to replace Crowley as mayor. Governor's orders, after 3 investigations into corruption. My job is to clean house, establish a functioning government again." He paused. "Crowley's men were waiting for us on the road. They knew we were coming. The revelation settled over Clara like fresh snow, cold at first, then oddly insulating. It explained so much: the attack, Jonas's reluctance to seek help. In town, the careful way he asked questions about Ironwood and its residents. "So you're not just a man who fixes broken things," she said finally. "That's exactly what I am," he countered, his eyes returning to hers. "Just on a larger scale than usual." Clara absorbed this, recalibrating everything she thought she knew about him. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question hung between them, laden with implications beyond the obvious. "Because for the first time in years, I was just Jonas," he answered, his voice dropping lower. "Not Sir or Mr. Whitmore or the government man. Here with you and the horses and the broken chicken coop, I was building something that didn't come with a title attached." Nina's voice called out to them, breaking the moment. "Look, I made a star," she shouted, pointing to her pine cone arrangement. Clara raised her hand in acknowledgement, but her mind was elsewhere, processing Jonas's revelation, and more troublingly, her own response to it. Not anger at being kept in the dark, but fear. Fear of what his role meant for his future. For their future, if such a thing existed. "You'll go to town then," she said, the words falling like stones from her lips. "When the road's clear." Jonas didn't answer immediately. When he did, his words were careful, measured. That was the plan. Was. Past tense. A small word that contained universes of possibility. The road to town cleared 3 days later. Jonas spent the morning gathering his and Nina's meager belongings, his movements slow, deliberate, as if prolonging each task might somehow extend their stay. Clara busied herself with farm chores, retreating into the practiced efficiency that had sustained her through years of solitude. They barely spoke, the air between them heavy with unvoiced thoughts. Only Nina seemed unchanged, chattering about the chickens, about the seedlings in the greenhouse, about the books Clara had lent her, speaking as if this day were like any other, as if departures weren't imminent. Clara found Jonas in the barn, adjusting the saddle on her chestnut mare. He'd offered to ride into town first, to assess the situation before bringing Nina. Clara had agreed, though the thought of him facing Crowley's men alone twisted something in her chest. "She pulls to the left," Clara said from the doorway. "If you give her too much lead." Jonas nodded, checking the cinch. "I'll keep that in mind." Clara stepped fully into the barn, the familiar smells of hay and horse and leather enveloping her. She held out a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Food, for the journey. He accepted it, their fingers brushing. Neither pulled away immediately. "Clara," he began. "Be careful," she interrupted, unable to bear whatever he might say. Goodbyes or promises, both would hurt equally. "Crowley still has allies in town." Jonas studied her face, his eyes searching for something she wasn't sure she could give. "I'll return tomorrow. Let you know what I find." Clara nodded, stepping back, creating necessary distance. "Nina can stay with me until you're settled." "Thank you." He mounted the horse with the ease of someone who'd spent a lifetime in saddles. Looking down at her, he seemed about to speak again, then thought better of it. Instead, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden figure. A horse, intricately carved, its mane flowing as if caught in mid-gallop. "For the kitchen window," he said, placing it in her palm. "To remind you that beautiful things can come from broken pieces." Clara's fingers closed around the carving, its edges smooth against her skin. She recognized the wood from the maple, branch that had fallen during the last storm, that she'd been meaning to chop for kindling. Words failed her. She nodded once, clutching the small horse as if it were something precious and fragile. Jonas turned the mare toward the barn door. "Till tomorrow, then." Clara watched him ride away, his figure growing smaller against the vast, white landscape, until he disappeared around the bend where the farm road met the main path to town. Only then did she open her hand to study the carving, the detail in the flowing mane, the proud arch of the neck, the power captured in the extended legs. It wasn't just any horse. It was Starlight, her favorite mare, the one she rode when the weight of memory became too heavy to bear on foot. He had seen her, truly seen her. Clara placed the carving on the windowsill in the kitchen, where the afternoon light caught the grain of the wood, bringing warmth to its surface. Nina found her there, staring at the small sculpture, lost in thought. "He makes those for people he loves," the child said matter-of-factly, climbing onto a chair to get a better look. "Made one for me when Mama died. A little bird." Clara's heart stuttered at the casual revelation. She busied herself with dinner, preparations, unwilling to examine the hope that flared within her. That night, the house felt emptier than it had in years. Clara lay awake, listening to the wind, to Nina's soft breathing from the room across the hall, to the absence that seemed louder than any presence had ever been. Jonas didn't return the next day, or the day after. By the third morning, Clara's worry had crystallized into a hard knot beneath her ribs. Nina asked questions Clara couldn't answer, her eyes growing more solemn with each evasion. On the fourth day, Clara made a decision. She saddled Starlight in the smaller bay gelding, helped Nina into her warmest clothes, and locked the farmhouse door for the first time in years. "So we're going to find your father," she told the child, boosting her onto the gelding's back. "Hold the reins just like I showed you." The ride to town stretched longer than Clara remembered. Ironwood had never felt like part of her world, even before Thomas's death. Now approaching its outskirts, she felt like an intruder in a foreign land. Houses emerged from the winter landscape, smoke curling from chimneys, windows gleaming with lamplight. Signs of life, of community, things Clara had convinced herself she no longer needed. Main Street was quiet in the late morning hours. Clara felt eyes on them as they rode, curtains twitching, shopkeepers pausing in doorways. News travelled fast in small towns. Their arrival would reach Crowley within minutes. They tied their horses outside the general store. Mrs. Patterson, who had owned it for as long as Clara could remember, greeted them with surprise that couldn't quite mask her curiosity. "Clara Beaumont," she said, wiping flour-covered hands on her apron. "Been an age since you graced us with your presence." Clara nodded, one hand on Nina's shoulder. "Looking for Jonas Whitmore. He rode into town 4 days ago." Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted, caution replacing curiosity. "The government man." She glanced around, then lowered her voice. "He's at Doc Miller's place, took a bad fall from his horse, they say." The cold that swept through Clara had nothing to do with the winter air. "Is he alive?" Mrs. Patterson assured her quickly. "But Doc's keeping visitors away. Says he needs rest." She bent to Nina's level. "Your daddy's tough as old boots, honey, don't you worry." Nina pressed closer to Clara's side, seeking reassurance Clara wasn't sure she could provide. "A fall," Clara repeated, disbelief evident in her tone. "Jonas rode too well for accidents." Mrs. Patterson's eyes held understanding. "That's the story Mayor Crowley's telling anyway." Clara thanked her with a nod and led Nina back outside. The doctor's house stood at the end of Main Street, its white clapboard exterior pristine against the muddy slush of the road. Clara hesitated, suddenly uncertain. She had avoided town for so long, had wrapped herself in isolation like a protective cloak. Now walking these streets again meant exposing herself to memories, to judgments, to the very community that had stood by while Thomas was murdered. Nina's small hand slipped into hers. "Papa needs us," she said simply. The truth of those words, the undeniable we implied in them, steeled Clara's resolve. They approached the doctor's house together, two figures against the winter landscape, connected by concern for the man who had bridged their separate solitudes. Doc Miller opened the door himself, recognition and surprise crossing his weathered face. "Clara," he said, her name a question and a statement combined. "We've come to see Jonas," she replied, straightforward as always. "His daughter and I." The doctor's eyes flickered to Nina, softening. He stepped back, opening the door wider. "He's been asking for you both, though he tried not to." Clara understood immediately. Jonas had been protecting them, keeping their connection hidden from Crowley's prying eyes. The realization washed over her like warm water, dissolving the last of her hesitation. Jonas lay in a narrow bed in the doctor's spare room, his face bruised, a bandage around his head. When they entered, his eyes found Clara's immediately, a complex emotion crossing his features: relief, joy, concern. You shouldn't have come, he said, even as his hand reached for Nina, who rushed to his bedside. Clearly we should have come sooner, Clara countered, taking in his injuries with a critical eye. Some fall you had. The corner of his mouth twitched. Upward. You should see the other guys. Nina climbed carefully onto the bed beside him, mindful of his injuries. Mrs. Patterson says you're tough as old boots, Jonas chuckled, then winced. Mrs. Patterson always did have a way with words. Clara moved closer, her fingers itching to check his bandages, to verify for herself that his wounds were being properly tended. What happened? She asked quietly. Crowley's welcome committee, Jonas replied, equally soft. 2 men. One with a familiar face, your neighbor, Ellis. Clara nodded, unsurprised. Ellis had coveted their land almost as much as Crowley. And now? Now, Jonas said, shifting to sit up straighter. The sheriff has officially recognized my appointment. Crowley's been given 24 hours to vacate the mayor's office. His eyes held hers steadily. It's happening, Clara. The change we've needed. We. The word echoed in Clara's mind, mirroring Nina's earlier assumption of connection. When had Ironwood's problems become partially hers again? When had she stopped seeing herself as separate from this community? She knew the answer, though she wasn't ready to voice it aloud. It had happened gradually, like spring thawing frozen ground, Jonas's stories of the town, his vision for what it could be, his belief that broken things deserved repair, including broken communities, including broken people. You'll stay with us until you're healed, she said, the decision forming as she spoke the words. The mayor's house can wait. Jonas's expression softened into something dangerously close to tenderness. Yes, ma'am, he agreed, his hand finding hers where it rested on the edge of the bed. If you'll have me. Clara didn't pull away from his touch. Instead, she turned her palm upward, allowing their fingers to intertwine, a gesture as significant as any vow, any promise exchanged. A choice made visible. Beyond the window, snow began to fall again, gentle flakes drifting past the glass. Not a blizzard this time, but a soft renewal covering old tracks, preparing the earth for eventual spring. They brought Jonas back to the farm the following day, Doc Miller's buggy navigating the still treacherous road with cautious precision. Clara rode ahead on Starlight, Nina secure before her in the saddle. The child's face turned toward the approaching farmhouse with unmistakable relief. Home, Nina whispered, the word fogging in the cold air. Clara felt the word settle in her chest like a stone dropping into still water, creating ripples she couldn't control. Home. When had her isolated refuge become that for this child? When had the walls that had contained her grief begun to expand, making room for new possibilities? Jonas watched from the buggy window as they approached, his face still bearing the marks of his fall, but his eyes clear and alert. When they helped him into the house, his hand lingered on the doorframe, a gesture Clara recognized, touching the threshold, acknowledging boundaries crossed, both physical and invisible. The next week passed in a rhythm different from before. Jonas's injuries required care, bandages changed, herbal compresses applied, mobility assisted. Clara found herself moving in his orbit, their bodies negotiating the shared space of healing with increasing fluidity. His hand on her shoulder, for balance. Her fingers brushing his forehead to check for fever, small contacts that left impressions like footprints in fresh snow. One evening, Clara found him sitting at Thomas's old desk in the study, papers spread before him, brow furrowed. In concentration, she paused in the doorway, struck by the sight, not by any perceived intrusion, but by how natural he looked there, as if the space had been waiting for him. He looked up, catching her observation. Town council records, he explained, gesturing. They'd of the documents. Sheriff Amos brought them by, thought I should see what we're dealing with. Clara entered, setting a mug of tea beside him. And what are we dealing with? Jonas's smile was tired but genuine. 5 years of creative accounting. Land deals that never quite made it into public record. He tapped a ledger. Including the attempted purchase of this farm, Clara stiffened. Thomas never agreed to sell. I know. Jonas reached for her hand, his touch tentative, offering comfort she could refuse. These records show Crowley forged documents after Thomas was gone, tried to claim he'd agreed to the sale before his death. Anger flared, a familiar heat. Then why hasn't he taken the land? If he has forgeries claiming ownership, because of you, Jonas said simply. You stayed. Made it impossible for him to enforce the false claim without exposing himself. His fingers tightened around hers. Your presence here wasn't just about honoring Thomas, Clara. You were protecting his legacy in ways you might not have even realized. The revelation washed over her, that her years of determined isolation had served a purpose beyond her own. Grief, that her stubborn refusal to leave had thwarted Crowley's plans in tangible ways. It shifted something fundamental in her understanding of the past 5 years. What happens now, she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Jonas regarded her thoughtfully. The council meets tomorrow. I'll present the evidence. Begin formal proceedings against Crowley. He paused. I'd like you to be there. Clara withdrew her hand, moving to the window. Outside, darkness had fallen, the farm transformed into a landscape of shadows and silver moonlight. I haven't set foot in that town hall since Thomas's funeral. I know what I'm asking, Jonas said quietly, but your testimony matters. The people of Ironwood need to see that standing against Crowley is possible. Clara traced the frost patterns on the glass, delicate whirls like fingerprints of winter itself. And after. When justice is done, what then? The question contained multitudes. About Ironwood, about Jonas's role there, about Nina's place in their lives, about the fragile thing growing between them that neither had yet named. Jonas rose from the desk, moving to stand beside her at the window. Not touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. I've been offered the mayor's position permanently, he said. The governor wants someone who knows the town, understands its problems. Clara nodded, unsurprised. You'd be good at it. Perhaps. He turned to face her, waiting until she met his gaze. But I've been thinking about a different arrangement. Oh? The word barely a breath. The mayor doesn't need to live in town, Jonas said carefully. Could live anywhere within the county limits, on a farm, perhaps, with good land and strong horses. His eyes held hers, vulnerable in their honesty. If the owner were amenable. Clara felt the weight of his unspoken proposal, not just of shared space, but of shared purpose, shared future. The thought both terrified and exhilarated her. The owner would need time, she said finally. To consider. Jonas nodded, accepting this boundary with character. Heuristic grace. Time is something I'm happy to give. Later, lying in bed, Clara listened to the sounds of the house, the settling of old beams, the occasional creak of floorboards as Jonas moved about in the room below, the faint whisper of Nina's breathing across the hall, sounds that had become familiar, necessary even. She reached for Thomas's photograph on her nightstand, studying his face in the moonlight. For the first time she spoke to him aloud, her voice barely disturbing the night stillness. I think you'd like him, she whispered. He fixes things, sees value in what others would discard. She traced Thomas's smile with her fingertip. I'm not forgetting you. I'm just continuing. She placed the photograph back, but deliberately set it farther from her bed than it had been before. Not gone, not forgotten, but positioned differently in her landscape. A shift small enough to be overlooked by anyone else, but significant to her. A choice being made, 1 degree at a time. The town hall of Ironwood stood at the center of Main Street, its red brick facade and white columns, a statement of permanence in a town built largely of wood and hope. Clara paused at the bottom of the steps, her heart hammering against her ribs. Beside her, Jonas waited patiently, his presence steady, undemanding. You don't have to do this, he reminded her softly. Clara straightened her spine, adjusted the collar of her best dress, navy blue, preserved from a time when social occasions had been part of her life. Yes, she said, I do. They ascended the steps together, Jonas's hand hovering near the small of her back, not quite touching but ready to support if needed. Nina had remained at the farm with Mrs. Patterson, who had volunteered to look after heard during the council meeting. The child had accepted this arrangement with surprising grace, extracting promises of a full report upon their return. Inside, the council chamber was already crowded, farmers in their Sunday best, shopkeepers in pressed shirts, women in their finest dresses. News of the special session had spread quickly. All eyes turned as Clara and Jonas entered, whispers rippling through the assembled crowd. The Beaumont widow, with the government man. Never thought she'd show her face here again. Clara kept her gaze forward, refusing to acknowledge the murmurs. Jonas guided her to a seat in the front row, then moved to the table where Sheriff Amos and 3 council members already sat. Notably absent was Mayor Crowley himself. The meeting began with formalities, roll calls, procedural matters, the reading of previous minutes. Clara sat motionless, her hands folded in her lap, feeling simultaneously exposed and invisible. The room where Thomas had once spoken passionately about sustainable farming practices, about community responsibility, about the future they were building together. Sheriff Amos stood, his weathered face solemn as he addressed the gathering. As you all know, we're here to address serious allegations against Mayor Crowley. Mr. Whitmore has been appointed by the governor to investigate these matters and has uncovered evidence that requires immediate action. Jonas rose next, his presence commanding attention without effort. He spoke clearly, methodically, presenting evidence of financial misconduct, of threats against business owners, of land acquired through questionable means. Clara watched the faces of the townspeople as understanding dawned, the gradual shift from disbelief to anger to resolve. Then Jonas turned to her. Mrs. Beaumont has agreed to testify regarding her own experience with Mayor Crowley's methods. Hush fell over the room as Clara stood, smoothing her skirt with hands that refused to tremble. She had rehearsed what she would say, had prepared herself for this moment of public declaration. But as she faced her neighbors, people who had attended her wedding, who had brought casseroles after Thomas's death, who had gradually stopped visiting as she withdrew into her grief, the prepared words dissolved. Instead, she spoke from a place deeper than memory, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the silent room. My husband believed in Ironwood, she began. He believed that a community is only as strong as its most vulnerable member, only as honest as its leaders. She recounted the pressure Thomas had faced to sell their farm, the escalating threats, the final confrontation that had left her a widow. She spoke without tears, without the rage that had sustained her for years, but with the clear-eyed certainty of truth that needed no embellishment. When she finished, the silence in the room felt different, charged with a collective reckoning. Then from the back of the chamber the doors burst open. Benjamin Crowley strode in, flanked by 2 men Clara recognized as part of his inner circle. His face was flushed with anger, his usual polished appearance disrupted by haste. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, glaring at the council members. "A meeting without notifying the mayor." Sheriff Amos stood. "You were notified, Ben, chose not to respond." Crowley's gaze swept the room, landing on Clara with particular venom. "So we're taking the word of a recluse widow now? A woman who's barely left her farm in 5 years, hardly a reliable witness." Before anyone could respond, Jonas stepped forward, placing himself between Clara and Crowley's accusatory stare. "We're taking the word of documented evidence," he said evenly. "Financial records, witness statements, your own ledgers, Mayor Crowley." The room erupted in voices, accusations, defenses, questions called out from every quarter. Clara remained standing, her eyes fixed on Crowley's increasingly desperate expression as he realized the extent of his exposure. Then, unexpectedly, a small figure pushed through the crowd. Nina, who should have been safely at the farm with Mrs. Patterson. She moved directly to Clara's side, slipping her hand into Clara's with natural confidence. "My papa fixes broken things," she announced, her clear voice cutting through the chaos. "And this town is broken too." The simplicity of the child's declaration brought a startling silence. Crowley stared at the little girl, momentarily speechless. In that pause, something shifted in the room, a collective recognition of truth spoken from the most unexpected source. Sheriff Amos cleared his throat. "Benjamin Crowley, by the authority vested in me by the state, I'm placing you under temporary Custody pending a full investigation. He nodded to his deputies, who moved forward, Crowley's face contorted with rage. "This isn't over," he spat, eyes darting between Jonas, Clara, and Nina. "This town needs me. You all need me." An elderly farmer, Mr. Hawkins, whose orchards bordered Clara's property, stood slowly from his seat. "No, Ben. We needed leadership. You gave us fear." He turned to Jonas. "Is it true? The governor sent you to be our new mayor?" Jonas nodded, his hand coming to rest lightly on Nina's shoulder. "If the council approves." Mr. Hawkins looked to Clara, something like apology in his weathered face. "And you, Clara, after everything, would you vouch for this man?" The question hung in the air, weighted with years of history, with communal guilt, with the possibility of reconciliation. Clara felt Nina's small hand in hers, felt Jonas's presence beside them both, not pushing, not demanding, but offering support for whatever she chose to say. Clara met Mr. Hawkins's gaze directly. "I would," she said simply. "He sees what needs mending, and he's not afraid of the work." Her words settled over the room like a benediction, a bridge extended across years of separation. As Crowley was led away, his protests fading down the corridor, Clara felt something release within her. Not forgiveness exactly, but a loosening of the grip the past had maintained on her present. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, gentle, flakes drifting past the tall windows of the council chamber. Nina pressed her face to the glass, watching the transformation with wonder. "It's like the world is starting over," she murmured. Clara's eyes met Jonas's above the child's head, finding in his gaze a question, a promise, a future unwritten but possible. "Yes," she agreed softly. "Sometimes it does that," spring announced. Itself in subtle ways. The lengthening of days, the softening of earth, the tentative green shoots emerging from soil long dormant. Clara moved through her morning chores with practiced efficiency. Though the routine had expanded to include new elements, coffee prepared for 3 instead of 1, extra eggs collected for Nina's insatiable appetite, the checking of Jonas's latest repair projects around the farm. 3 months had passed since the council meeting, since Crowley's arrest and subsequent removal from office. Jonas had been officially installed as mayor, though he had indeed chosen to make his residence at Harper's Hollow rather than the traditional mayor's house in town. The arrangement raised eyebrows initially, but the practical benefits soon became apparent. The farm provided a neutral meeting ground for opposing factions within Ironwood, a place removed from old political battlegrounds. The barn, once Clara's private sanctuary, had gradually transformed into something new. Jonas had reinforced its structure, added windows for better light, built a long table from reclaimed wood. Now, twice weekly, it filled with townspeople coming to discuss irrigation, projects, school improvements, road repairs. Clara provided coffee and her increasingly famous apple cake, observing the proceedings with quiet interest, occasionally offering practical insights that cut through theoretical debates. On this particular morning, Clara paused in her weeding to watch Nina in the paddock, patiently brushing Starlight's mane. The girl had grown an inch since winter, her face losing some of its childish roundness, her condi. Fidance with the horses now approaching expertise. She sang softly as she worked, a melody Clara recognized as one Thomas had often whistled while tending the fields. The realization didn't bring the sharp pain it once might have. Instead, Clara felt a gentle melancholy, a recognition that memories could be carried forward, transformed into new patterns without losing their essential truth. Jonas emerged from the barn, sawdust clinging to his shirt, evidence of the shelves he was building for the community library project. He spotted Clara and changed direction, approaching with the easy stride that had become familiar. "Welcome. The Petersons are bringing their proposal for the irrigation cooperative this afternoon," he said, stopping beside her. "Mrs. Davidson's making her rhubarb pie." Clara nodded, returning to her weeding. "I'll set out the extra chairs." Jonas knelt beside her, his hands joining hers in the soil, working in tandem to clear the young bean shoots of encroaching weeds. They moved together with the synchronicity of practice, of shared purpose, of growing understanding. "Harper's Hollow is becoming the heart of Ironwood," Jonas observed, his voice carrying no judgment, merely stating a truth they both recognized. Clara sat back on her heels, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. Thomas would have liked that. He always said a farm should feed more than bodies. Jonas's smile was gentle. He was right. He hesitated, then added, Nina's teacher mentioned she's the only child in her class without a proper surname. The school records need updating. The statement contained a question Clara had been anticipating, had seen forming in Jonas's eyes during quiet evenings by the fire. In the careful way he maintained a separate bedroom, despite the understanding growing between them. Whitmore is a good name, she said carefully. Strong. It is. Jonas's hand stilled in the soil. Though I've been thinking Beaumont Whitmore has a certain ring to it. For Nina, at least. Clara's heart quickened at the implication. Hyphenated. Names are complicated on legal documents. So I've heard. Jonas met her gaze directly, the morning sunlight revealing flecks of amber in his blue eyes. Worth the extra ink, though, if the parties involved are agreeable. Clara looked away, toward Nina in the paddock, toward the farmhouse with its newly repaired roof, toward the barn now serving as Ironwood's unofficial town hall. Everything transformed, everything recognizable. I still wear his ring, she said, quietly, the gold band catching the light as she turned her hand. Jonas nodded, understanding the complexity of her statement. I know I'm not asking you to remove it, just to consider making room for something additional. The metaphor wasn't lost on Clara. Making room, expanding rather than replacing, adding new chapters without erasing what came before. It reflected exactly what had happened to Harper's Hollow over the past months. I'll consider it, she said finally, returning to her weeding with renewed focus, though the smile tugging at the corners of her mouth betrayed her composure. Jonas respected her, need for space rising and brushing soil from his knees. I'll finish those shelves before the meeting. He started toward the barn, then paused, turning back. By the way, Sheriff Amos mentioned they've set a trial date for Crowley, next month. Clara nodded, absorbing this information. The final resolution of a chapter that had defined her life for too long. Will you testify? We both will, if you're willing. Jonas's expression held no pressure, only support for whatever she decided. Clara thought of the council meeting, of standing before her neighbors after years of isolation, of the unexpected liberation in speaking her truth aloud. Yes, she said. I'll be there. His smile warmed her more than the spring sunshine. As he walked away, Clara allowed herself to watch him, the confidence in his stride, the strength in his shoulders, the way he paused to ruffle Nina's hair as he passed the paddock. Not Thomas, never Thomas, but someone worthy in his own right, someone who had earned his place in her landscape through patience and integrity, and the quiet courage of remaining present when it would have been easier to leave. Later, as dusk settled over the farm and the last of the irrigation committee members departed, Clara found herself alone on the porch, watching fireflies emerge like earthbound stars across the fields. The evening air carried the scent of fresh-turned soil and blooming apple trees, a perfume no city dweller could appreciate fully. Jonas joined her, 2 mugs of tea in hand. They stood in companionable silence, shoulders nearly touching, watching. Darkness claimed the land that had sustained 3 generations of Beaumonts. I've been thinking, Clara said finally, about names, about what they signify. Jonas waited, giving her the space to find her words. This land has always been Harper's Hollow, even though my family name is Beaumont. She turned the mug in her hands. Because some things are bigger than the people who tend them. They have their own identity, their own purpose. Jonas nodded, understanding flowing between them. And people? Do they remain defined by the names they're given, or by the lives they build? Clara considered this, watching a firefly land briefly on the porch railing, its gentle glow pulsing like a heartbeat. Both, I think. Names carry history, but they're also vessels we fill with our choices. She turned to face him fully, allowing him to see the decision in her eyes. I think Nina deserves a choice, about her name, about where she belongs. Jonas set his mug down carefully, his movements deliberate as he processed her words. And you? What do you deserve, Clara? The question caught her off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because so few people in her life had ever asked what she wanted, what she needed for herself, rather than in service to others. I deserve, she began, then paused, recalibrating. I want the chance to build something new, without forgetting what came before. Jonas's hand found hers, fingers intertwining with the naturalness of long practice. That seems like something worth working toward. Clara looked down at their joined hands, his calloused from carpentry and writing, hers from gardening and animal care. Different paths, complementary strengths. Yes, she agreed softly. It does. They remained on the porch until stars populated the sky, making plans for tomorrow's town meeting, for the summer's crops, for the life they were carefully, deliberately, building together, not despite their separate pasts, but because of them. The county courthouse stood imposing against the summer sky, its stone facade a testament to permanence, to authority, to the weight of justice. Clara descended from the wagon, her best dress smoothed, her hair arranged with unusual care. Jonas helped Nina down, straightening the child's collar with gentle hands. Remember what we discussed, he told her. You'll stay with Mrs. Patterson, in the waiting area. This isn't a place for children. Nina nodded solemnly, though her eyes darted curiously to the courthouse doors where people streamed in, eager to witness Benjamin Crowley's trial. The case had drawn attention from neighboring counties, newspapers sending reporters to document the fall of a man once considered untouchable. Clara knelt before the girl, adjusting the ribbon in her hair. We won't be long, and afterward we'll visit the bookshop like I promised. Nina's face brightened at this reminder. For the new horse book? For the new horse book, Clara confirmed, her heart expanding at the simple joy in the child's expression. When had Nina's happiness become so intrinsically linked to her own? When had this girl, who appeared during a blizzard, become as necessary as sunrise? Inside, the courthouse hummed with anticipation. Clara felt eyes following their progress down the central aisle, Jonas in his official capacity as mayor, she as the widow, whose testimony formed a cornerstone of the case against Crowley. After delivering Nina to Mrs. Patterson's care, they took their seats near the front, where the prosecutor had requested they remain accessible. The proceedings began with formal declarations, legal terminology that washed over Clara like waves against a shore, present but not penetrating. Her focus remained on the moments to come, on the words she would speak, on the truth she would finally deliver in its entirety. When Crowley entered, flanked by guards, Clara felt rather than saw Jonas, tense beside her. The former mayor had lost weight during his months in custody, his once imposing frame diminished, his customary swagger replaced by careful movements. Yet his eyes, when they swept the courtroom, retained their calculating coldness. Those eyes found Clara, narrowed in recognition, and something darker, resentment perhaps, or the peculiar hatred reserved for those who survive what was meant to destroy them. Clara met his gaze steadily, without flinching, without the fear that had once accompanied any thought of this man. She had faced him in the town hall months ago. This was merely the culmination of a confrontation long overdue. The prosecutor called witness after witness, shopkeepers describing extortion, farmers recounting threatened foreclosures, the county clerk testifying to altered records. The pattern emerged clearly. Systematic corruption spanning years, a web of influence and intimidation with Crowley at its center. Then it was Jonas's turn. He rose, squeezed Clara's hand briefly, and moved to the witness stand with the measured confidence that had earned him Ironwood's trust. He spoke clearly, presenting evidence discovered during his investigation, ledgers revealing embezzled funds, correspondence documenting illegal land acquisitions, testimony from former associates who had turned against Crowley in exchange for leniency. Throughout Jonas's testimony, Clara watched the jury's faces, the growing understanding, the dawning indignation. These 12 citizens from neighboring counties had no personal stake in Ironwoods. Politics, yet human nature, recognized injustice, responded to it on a level beyond geographical boundaries. When Jonas finished, the prosecutor turned to Clara. The state calls Clara Beaumont to the stand. The walk to the witness box seemed both endless and instantaneous. Clara felt the weight of every eye in the courtroom, heard the rustle of movement as people leaned forward, eager to hear from the woman who had become almost mythical in her isolation, in her quiet defiance of Crowley's ambitions. After being sworn in, Clara settled into the hard wooden chair, her hands folded in her lap. The prosecutor approached, his manner respectful. "Mrs. Beaumont, please tell the court about your husband's interaction with the defendant in the months before his death." Clara drew a deep breath, then began to speak, not with the practiced phrases she had rehearsed, but with the simple clarity of truth long contained. She described Thomas's refusal to sell their farm despite escalating offers, the confrontation at their property line, the threats that became increasingly specific. She recounted finding Thomas by the North Oak, the investigation that concluded with vague findings of dispute over property, the subsequent years of isolation as Crowley's influence expanded throughout Ironwood. When asked about the forged documents claiming Thomas had agreed to sell before his death, Clara's voice remained steady, though her hands tightened around each other. "My husband believed land wasn't just something you owned," she said. "It was something you were responsible for. He would never have sold Harper's Hollow, especially not to someone who saw it only as an investment opportunity." During cross-examination, Crowley's lawyer attempted to undermine her testimony, suggesting grief had colored her recollections, implying her isolation had affected her reliability. "Mrs. Beaumont, in the 5 years since your husband's unfortunate passing, you've had minimal contact with the community of Ironwood. Some might say you've become detached from reality. How can you be certain your memories are accurate?" Clara met the lawyer's gaze directly. "Isolation doesn't cause amnesia, counselor. It clarifies what matters." She glanced briefly toward Jonas, then back to the lawyer. "And I'm not as isolated as you suggest. My farm has become a gathering place for Ironwood citizens. Perhaps you should attend a town meeting there sometime, see for yourself." A ripple of response moved through the courtroom. Not quite laughter, but a collective acknowledgement of a direct hit. The lawyer moved on quickly to less dangerous questions. When finally released from the stand, Clara returned to her seat beside Jonas, feeling lighter than she had in years. The truth, spoken aloud, had weight, but also wings. It settled the past while creating space for what came next. The trial continued for 3 more days, but the outcome seemed increasingly inevitable. On the 4th morning, the jury returned with their verdict, guilty on all counts. Crowley's sentencing would come later, but the essential truth had been established, documented, made part of public record. No more whispers, no more unspoken knowledge, no more power held through fear and manipulation. Outside the courthouse, Clara stood with Jonas and Nina in the summer sunshine, watching as townspeople approached them, not with the awkward sympathy of the bereaved, but with the respect accorded to those who stand for principle. Mr. Hawkins shook Jonas's hand, then Clara's, his weathered face solemn. "Thomas would be proud," he said simply, "of both of you." The words settled over Clara like a benediction. She felt Nina's hand slip into hers, felt Jonas's arm brush against her shoulder, the physical manifestations of connections re-established, of community restored, of a future opening before her like a road newly revealed. Later, as promised, they visited the bookshop, Nina darting immediately to the display of newly arrived children's books. Clara watched her, this child who had appeared during the worst blizzard in years, who had brought life back to Harper's Hollow through questions and laughter and unguarded affection. Jonas stood beside her, his presence a comfort that required no words. "What are you thinking?" he asked finally, his voice pitched for her ears alone. Clara considered the question, watching as Nina carefully selected her book, hugging it to her chest with visible delight. "I'm thinking about circles," she said, "about how endings can lead to beginnings if we're brave enough to follow them through." Jonas's hand found hers, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "And are you brave enough?" Clara turned to him fully, meeting his gaze with newfound certainty. "I'm starting to believe I might be." Autumn painted Harper's Hollow in hues of amber and crimson, the apple orchard heavy with fruit, the fields golden with ripened wheat. Clara stood on the porch steps, watching as wagons arrived from town, families bearing covered dishes and harvest offerings. The traditional equinox gathering, once a cornerstone of Ironwood's community life abandoned during Crowley's years of influence, had been revived, with Harper's Hollow serving as its natural location. The barn, transformed now with festive decorations, dried corn husks, pumpkins, garlands of colored leaves, hummed with activity. Tables stretched its length, gradually filling with autumn abundance. Mrs. Patterson's famous apple pies, the Hawkins family's preserved peaches, fresh bread from the newly reopened bakery, cider pressed just that morning from Clara's own orchard. Nina darted between arriving guests, her hair braided with yellow ribbons, her excitement palpable. This was her first harvest festival, an occasion she had anticipated for weeks, helping to decorate the barn, to polish apples for display, to create handwritten place cards for the long tables. Clara smoothed her dress, new for the occasion, deep burgundy like the turning maple leaves. Jonas had insisted, had arranged for the dressmaker to visit the farm, had watched with undisguised appreciation when she first tried it on. "You look like autumn itself," he had said, his voice warm with admiration, all fire and harvest gold. Now he approached from the direction of the orchard, carrying a basket of late-ripening apples. His shirt sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms tanned from months of outdoor work. Mayor in title, farmer in practice, he had balanced both roles with surprising grace, bringing to Ironwood's governance the same patient attention he gave to repairing fences and nurturing crops. "Sheriff Amos just arrived," he reported, setting down the basket. "Says the road from Miller's Creek is finally cleared after those rains. More guests on the way." Clara nodded, taking in the scene before them, the farm alive with voices, with laughter, with the sounds of a community reconnecting. "I never thought I'd see Harper's Hollow like this again," she admitted softly. Jonas's hand found the small of her back, a gentle touch that had become essential to her sense of balance. "Thomas laid the foundation," he said. "We're just continuing what he started, we." The word no longer caused Clara to stiffen, to retreat into protective solitude. It had become a comfort, an acknowledgement of shared purpose, of complementary strengths, of a future being built through mutual choice rather than obligation. As evening approached, lanterns were lit throughout the farm, hanging from tree branches, lining the path to the barn, creating pools of golden light in the gathering darkness. Music began, fiddles and guitars played by local musicians, melodies that had been part of Ironwood's heritage for generations. Clara moved among her guests, no longer the isolated widow, but the heart of this gathering, accepting offers of help, with quiet grace, directing children toward games organized in the side yard, ensuring everyone felt welcomed, included, essential to the celebration. When the tables were cleared and the dancing began, Clara found herself watching from the barn doorway, content to observe as couples spun across the improvised dance floor. Nina danced with Mr. Hawkins' grandson, her face flushed with delight, her movements earnest if not always coordinated. Jonas appeared beside Clara, slightly breathless from helping rearrange tables to create space for the dancers. "Sheriff Amos says the sentencing is official," he said quietly. 20 years, no possibility of early release." Clara absorbed this information, the final resolution of a chapter that had defined her life for too long. "Good," she said simply. Nothing more needed to be said. Jonah studied her face in the lantern light, his expression softening into something she had come to recognize, to anticipate. "Dance with me?" he asked, extending his hand. Clara hesitated. She hadn't danced since, before Thomas's death, had forgotten the feel of it, the vulnerability of moving in harmony with another person. "I'm out of practice," she demurred. "So am I," Jonas admitted. "We can remember together." Together. Another word that had been reclaimed, repurposed, filled with new meaning. Clara placed her hand in his, allowing him to lead her to the edge of the dance floor. The musicians had shifted to a slower melody, a waltz that seemed to rise and fall like the hills surrounding Ironwood. Jonas's hand settled at her waist, warm and secure. They began to move, awkwardly at first, then with increasing confidence, as muscle memory returned, as their bodies found shared rhythm. Clara felt herself relaxing into the dance, into the moment, into the simple joy of movement and music and conics. "Tion, I have something for you," Jonas said, his voice low near her ear. "Been waiting for the right time." They continued dancing as he reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small wooden object. Clara looked down to find a carved pendant on a leather cord, an intricate rendering of Harper's Hollow as seen from the North Ridge, the farmhouse and barn and fields captured in miniature, every detail rendered with loving precision. Jonas. His name was all she could manage, emotion, closing her throat. "Turn it over," he encouraged gently. She did, finding words carved on the back in his careful hand, where broken pieces create something whole. Clara's eyes met his, finding in his gaze the question he had been patient enough not to rush, wise enough not to force. Her fingers closed around the pendant, feeling the smooth wood warm against her palm. "Yes," she whispered, the word barely audible above the music but unmistakable in its certainty. His smile bloomed slowly, transforming his face. "You're sure?" Clara nodded, her decision not impulsive, but the natural culmination of months of gradual healing, of boundaries carefully dismantled, of trust painstakingly rebuilt. "Nina needs a proper home, with parents who—" She paused, finding the courage to name what had been growing between them. "Who love each other." Jonas's hand tightened at her waist, drawing her closer as they continued to dance. "And the name?" he asked, referencing conversations they'd had about whether she would keep Beaumont, take Whitmore, or choose a hyphenated combination. Clara considered this, watching as Nina twirled past with another young partner, her face alight with uncomplicated happiness. "Harper," she said finally. "Clara Harper, Jonas Harper, Nina Harper." She met his questioning gaze with newfound certainty. "Named for this place that brought us together, for the hollow that became filled." Understanding dawned in Jonas's eyes, the rightness of it, the symmetry, the way it honored what came before while creating space for what followed. "The Harpers of Harper's Hollow," he murmured, testing the sound of it, "has a certain poetry." The dance ended, the musicians pausing to tune their instruments. Around them, neighbors and friends continued their celebrations, unaware of the moment, unfolding in their midst. Nina approached, breathless from dancing, her eyes immediately drawn to the pendant in Clara's hand. "It's our farm!" she exclaimed, examining the carving with wonder. "Papa's been working on that forever." Jonas chuckled, ruffling her hair. "Not forever, Songbird, just until I got it right." Nina looked between them, her perceptive gaze noting Clara's flushed cheeks, the pendant now hanging around her neck, the way Jonas's hand remained at Clara's waist. "Does this mean we're staying for always?" Clara exchanged a glance with Jonas, then knelt to Nina's level, taking the child's hands in hers. "It means we're building something together, the three of us." She touched the pendant at her throat. "Something new but rooted in what's always been here." Nina considered this, her young face solemn with the weight of understanding beyond her years. Then she smiled, the expression transforming her face into a mirror of Jonas's. "Like when we planted those apple trees in spring. They're new trees, but they came from the old orchard's seeds." Clara's heart expanded at the child's simple wisdom. "Exactly like that. New growth from established roots." The musicians began again, a lively reel that pulled dancers back to the floor. Nina tugged at Jonas's hand. "Come on, Papa. You promised to dance with me too." Jonas laughed, allowing himself to be pulled away, but not before his eyes met Clara's once more, a look that contained promises, certainty, a future being written with each passing day. Clara moved to the barn doorway, watching as father and daughter spun among neighbors and friends, their movements joyful, unrestrained. Beyond them, Harper's Hollow spread in all directions. Fields now harvested, orchards yielding their fruit, pastures where horses grazed peacefully beneath the harvest moon. She touched the wooden pendant, feeling its contours beneath her fingers. Not a replacement for her wedding band, which still encircled her finger, but an addition, a tangible symbol of capacity expanded, of love that grew rather than diminished, of a heart that had learned it could hold past and present simultaneously, without betraying either. The night air carried the scent of ripened apples, of wood smoke, of earth preparing for winter's rest before spring's inevitable renewal. Clara breathed deeply, filling her lungs, her body, her spirit with the essence of home. Not just a place of four walls and a roof, but a landscape of connection, of purpose, of belonging. Home, she whispered to the night, to the stars emerging. Above, to Thomas's memory, to the future unfolding before her. Not four walls, but the hands that choose to build with you. And somewhere in the gentle autumn breeze, in the music spilling from the barn, in the laughter of a child who had appeared during a blizzard, Clara felt the universe acknowledge her words, not with dramatic confirmation, but with the quiet certainty of rightness, of balance restored, of wounds transformed into wisdom.